Of the 100 billion people that have ever lived on Earth, more than half were killed by mosquito-borne illness, the deadliest of which is malaria. Malaria is still a modern problem, of course. In 2020, more than 600,000 people worldwide were killed by malaria, although it was a lot worse just 1 century ago. In World War II, for example, for every American slain on the Pacific Front, more than 8 American soldiers were killed by malaria. Given that malaria was 8 times more deadly than the entire force of Japan, it would not be an overstatement to say that America's fate on the Pacific Front hinged entirely on the only known antidote to malaria, called quinine. Quinine is a chemical found in the bark of the cinchona tree, which is native to the forest near the Andes Mountains in South America. Quinine works by interfering with the protozoan's ability to digest red blood cells in malaria. Although a miracle cure, quinine is far from a pleasant cure. Quinine has such a bitter taste that British officials in India that drank quinine-infused water masked the bitter taste with alcohol, hence the gin and tonic. Even though quinine was a miracle cure for malaria, South American governments were very greedy with the cinchona bark. They often charged exorbitant prices and let people die rather than lower their profits. This was made worse when these governments would overstrip the bark, killing the tree, where they would then fail to replant the tree, of course. This got so bad that by the 1800s this medicine was on the verge of extinction. So European countries ended up sending brave spies into the depths of South America to hopefully steal some cinchona saplings. If caught, the penalty for these spies was certainly torture and probably death. Most of the times these spies returned with nothing, and even the few successes turned out to be failures as cinchona bark has wildly different amounts of quinine. The average cinchona tree had about 5% quinine, but the ones the smugglers got out had as little as 0.4% quinine. It would almost be comical if the stakes weren't so high. Luckily, one Englishman was able to smuggle out some cinchona seeds with a remarkable 13% quinine. Without knowing how valuable these seeds would be, he sold them to the Dutch government for what one historian called the greatest $20 ever spent. Within a couple decades, the Dutch were cultivating massive plantations of cinchona trees on the island of Java, leading to the death of the quinine industry in South America. Failing to learn any meaningful lessons, the Dutch also turned their cinchona trees into a monopoly, charging ludicrous prices for the vital medicine all through the 1800s and 1900s until World War II started in 1939. In 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands, and one of their main priorities was taking all the Dutch quinine stores for the Axis North African campaign. Thankfully, there was still the Java plantation until Japan suddenly conquered Java in February of 1942, and just like that, the Allies were starved of quinine. The results were devastating. Many of the Pacific Islands were full of marshes, foxholes, and artillery craters full of water, perfect for growing mosquitoes. The Allies did distribute mosquito nets, however, many were damaged or often ignored in the chaos of war. There were some medicines that would help you prevent malaria contraction, but they had horrible side effects like nausea and diarrhea. Military hospitals tried their best, but they couldn't force the soldiers to take their anti-malaria meds, leading to this now iconic photo saying they didn't take their drugs. It was no use as more than 8 times the amount of military personnel died of malaria as from the Japanese army. More than 60% of American troops on the Pacific Front contracted malaria, 600,000 soldiers overall. When Java fell, the US called several of the world's best botanists to try to find large amounts of cinchona bark in South America. One particular plant scientist named Raymond Fosberg went down to Colombia to try and find some cinchona bark. Overall, Fosberg located 12.5 million pounds of bark from 180,000 trees. This does sound like a lot, however it was not nearly enough as, again, the amount of quinine in the bark was comically low. That's when one night in 1944, Fosberg was approached by 2 unknown Nazi spies who had somehow tracked Fosberg down. Not only do we have no idea who these Nazis were, but we have no idea how they found Fosberg. Truly a strange phenomenon. Fosberg, who never imagined he would die for botany, was truly petrified. However, what happened next would be even more surprising than even the Nazis finding him way out in the Andes Mountains. The Nazi spies were not there to kill him or even arrest him, they were there to talk business. They had stolen a huge stash of pure quinine from German storage, and they wanted to sell it to the United States of America. They of course charged a wildly inflated price for this quinine, however America was in no position to negotiate. Frankly, they were no heroes. They were slimy Nazi operatives profiteering off the war. However, they no doubt saved tens of thousands of American lives in the Pacific Front. By the end of 1944, American deaths in the Pacific Front had dropped to just 20% of what they were in 1943. and America finally conquered the Philippines, no doubt assisted by these two unidentified Nazi agents. Malaria was still a problem, but however crazy it sounds, we can thank greedy Nazi opportunists that it wasn't the giant problem that it once was on the Pacific Front. Thanks for watching. Bye everybody.